I was just fixing her air conditioner. That's all it was supposed to be. But when Leila looked me straight in the eye and asked, "I'm 50. Do you think I'm too old for love?" Everything I thought I knew about second chances, about courage, and about the woman standing in front of me with grease on her hands and hope in her voice changed forever. Some repairs fix more than just broken machines. The morning started like every other Tuesday in Phoenix. Brutal heat before 7 a.m. and my phone buzzing with more service calls than I could handle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I was sprawled across my couch, still in yesterday's work shirt, nursing lukewarm coffee from a mug that read "World's Okayest HVAC Tech," a birthday gift from my sister Maxine, who thought she was hilarious. The coffee tasted like disappointment and burnt dreams, but it was caffeine, so it would do. My phone lit up with a text from Mom. "Blake, the garbage disposal is making that grinding noise again. Also, Mrs. Rodriguez next door thinks her pool pump is haunted. Call me." I stared at the message, wondering when I became the family's designated fix-it guy for everything from haunted pool pumps to my nephew Zion's Xbox that mysteriously stopped working whenever he was grounded. Then the work phone rang. The display showed L. Morrison with an address on Saguaro Street. I almost didn't answer. Tuesdays were usually booked solid, and the last thing I needed was another emergency call about someone's AC dying in 115-degree weather. But something made me pick up. "Desert Air Solutions, this is Blake," I said, already reaching for my keys and wondering if I had enough refrigerant in the truck. "Hi, this might sound desperate, but my air conditioner just gave up." The voice was warm, slightly frazzled, with just a hint of a New England accent. I know it's probably the worst possible day to call with this heat wave, but I have my elderly father visiting, and I'm worried about him. I can pay extra if you can squeeze me in. There was something in her voice. Not panic exactly, but genuine concern mixed with the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to hold everything together when the universe keeps throwing curveballs. I found myself saying, "I can be there in 40 minutes, before my brain caught up with my mouth." "Really? Oh my God, thank you. I'm at 2847 Saguaro Street. I'll be the one standing in my driveway looking like I just lost a fight with a cactus." Laughed despite myself. "See you soon, Ms. Morrison." I grabbed my toolbox, threw on a clean shirt that only had minor grease stains, and headed out into what felt like the surface of Mars. Phoenix in July was not for the weak, and today the weather app cheerfully informed me it would hit 118 degrees, perfect conditions for an AC emergency. The drive to Saguaro Street took me through the older part of town, where the houses had actual personality instead of the cookie-cutter subdivisions spreading across the desert like beige tumbleweeds. Adobe walls, red tile roofs, and front yards that managed to look lush despite the obvious water restrictions. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' names and still borrowed cups of sugar. 47 was a single-story adobe house painted the color of desert sand, with a small front garden that somehow thrived in conditions that would kill a lesser landscape. Drought-resistant plants created splashes of purple and yellow against the neutral backdrop, and a covered porch offered blessed shade. It looked like someone had put thought into making a home, not just buying a house. True to her word, there was a woman standing in the driveway, and she did indeed look like she'd tangled with desert flora and lost. Her dark hair was escaping from what had probably started as a neat ponytail. She had dirt smudges on her white tank top, and she was holding a garden hose with the defeated expression of someone who'd just realized that spraying water on an air conditioning unit was not, in fact, a viable repair strategy. I parked the truck and grabbed my diagnostic equipment. As I walked up the driveway, she looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that reaches your eyes and makes you forget it's hot enough to fry an egg on the sidewalk. "Blake?" she asked, turning off the hose and wiping her hands on a towel that hung from her belt loop. "I'm Leila. Thank you so much for coming out here. I know you probably have a million other calls today." "That's what I'm here for," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm, and her hands had the slight calluses that came from real work. Gardening, maybe, or home improvement projects. "Let's take a look at what we're dealing with." She led me around to the side of the house where the outdoor unit sat silent and accusatory in a small gravel area. It was making this awful grinding noise yesterday, like a blender full of rocks. And then this morning it just stopped. The inside unit is blowing warm air, and with my dad here. She gestured helplessly at the motionless machine. I knelt down and opened my toolbox, the familiar ritual of diagnosis beginning. "How old is your father?" I asked, pulling out my multimeter. 78, and stubborn as a mule. He insists he's fine, but he's been through a lot lately. Lost my mom 6 months ago, and I finally convinced him to come stay with me for a while. The last thing he needs is to spend his first week here melting in a house that feels like a sauna. There was something in the way she said it. A mixture of love, worry, and the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from being someone's primary support system. I recognized it because I'd seen it in my own mirror after Dad's heart attack last year, when suddenly I was the one making sure he took his medications and didn't try to climb ladders to clean gutters. "We'll get him comfortable," I said, meaning it. "Let me see what's going on with this unit." As I started my inspection, removing the access panel and checking connections, Leila hovered nearby. Not in an annoying way, but like someone who genuinely wanted to understand what was happening to her home's life support system. "Can I get you some water?" she asked. "Or iced tea?" I made a pitcher this morning before everything went sideways. "Iced tea sounds perfect," I said, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm. As she headed toward the house, I caught myself watching her go. The confident stride of someone comfortable in her own space, the way she automatically deadheaded a wilted flower on her way past a planter. There was something about Leila Morrison that made me want to take my time with this repair. She returned with a tall glass of iced tea that was so cold, it made the glass sweat immediately in the desert heat. Real tea, not from a powder, with just the right amount of sweetness and a sprig of fresh mint that she must have grown herself. "You're a lifesaver," I said, taking a long drink. "This is incredible." "My mom's recipe," she said, settling into a lawn chair that had seen better days but was positioned perfectly in the shade. "She always said the secret was brewing it strong enough to wake the dead, then adding enough ice to put them back to sleep." I laughed, nearly choking on my tea. "Your mom sounds like she was a character." She was. Leila's smile turned wistful. "Dad's having a hard time without her. They were married 43 years, and she was the one who handled all the social stuff, made friends wherever they went. Dad's more of the strong, silent type. He builds things, fixes things, provides, but making conversation with strangers? That was always Mom's department. And now you're trying to fill that gap," I said, checking the capacitor connections. Trying being the operative word. I moved out here 5 years ago for a fresh start after my divorce, and I thought I was finally getting my life together. Nice. House. Good job at the community college. I teach English literature. Quiet neighborhood where I could just exist. Then Mom got sick, and suddenly I'm trying to convince Dad that Phoenix isn't actually a form of cruel and unusual punishment. I found the problem. A burnt-out capacitor and a seized compressor bearing that had probably been grinding its way to failure for weeks. "Well, I've got good news and bad news about your AC situation." "Hit me with the bad news first. I'm all ready, mentally preparing to spend my savings on a hotel room for Dad. The capacitor's shot, and your compressor bearing is toast. That's why it was making that grinding noise before it gave up completely. And the good news? It's fixable. I've got the parts in my truck, and it won't take more than an hour. You won't need that hotel room." Relief washed over her face. "Oh, thank God. What do I owe you for the house call and parts?" I quoted her a fair price, watching her mentally calculate whether it fit her budget. When she nodded without hesitation, I realized she was probably one of those people who would pay whatever it took to take care of family, even if it meant eating ramen for a month. "While I work on this, why don't you check on your dad?" I suggested. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Make sure he's staying hydrated. I'll have you back to Arctic temperatures in no time. She stood up, then paused. "Can I ask you something? Do you like what you do? I mean, really like it, not just tolerate it for the paycheck?" The question caught me off guard. Most customers asked about warranties or payment plans, not job satisfaction. That's actually a really good question. I do, yeah. There's something satisfying about fixing things that are broken, making people comfortable again. Plus, in Phoenix, I'm basically a superhero from May through September. She laughed. The AC whisperer. Exactly. Though my cape is just a tool belt, and my superpower is not passing out in 118-degree weather. That's a pretty valuable superpower. In this town, I started working on removing the old capacitor, and she headed inside. Through the open sliding door, I could hear her talking to someone. Presumably her father. The conversation was muffled, but the tone was gentle, patient. She was clearly used to being a caregiver. A few minutes later, an older man appeared, at the sliding door. Tall, weathered, with the kind of deep tan that comes from a lifetime of outdoor work. He was wearing a button-up shirt despite the heat, because men of his generation believed in dressing properly, even when staying in their daughter's house during a heat wave. "You the AC fellow?" he called out. "Yes, sir. Blake Davidson. Should have you cooled down shortly." He walked over, moving with the careful gait of someone whose joints had put in decades of hard labor. "Paul Morrison. Appreciate you coming out so quick. Leila was worried I'd melt into a puddle. Your daughter seems like she takes good care. Of you." "She does. Better than I deserve, probably. I keep telling her she doesn't need to fuss over an old man, but she's stubborn. Gets that from her mother." He watched me work for a moment. "You do good work. Methodical. I can appreciate that. What kind of work did you do, Mr. Morrison?" "Construction. 40 years building houses back in Vermont. Retired 3 years ago, and Margaret, that's my wife. She had all these plans for traveling, visiting grandkids, seeing the country." His voice caught slightly. "Funny how life has other ideas. I'm sorry for your loss, sir." He nodded, the kind of sharp, controlled nod men of his generation used to manage grief. "Leila thinks the desert air will be good for me. All I know is, everything here is either too hot, too spiky, or too beige." I grinned. "Give it time. Phoenix grows on you, like a cactus that eventually flowers. That's what she keeps saying." He paused, studying the AC unit like he was contemplating its mechanical mysteries. "She's a good kid. Smart, too smart for her own good sometimes. Worries about everyone except herself." There was something in the way he said it, a father's concern, mixed with pride and maybe a touch of guilt. "She mentioned she teaches at the community college? English literature. Can quote Shakespeare and Dickinson by heart. But ask her when she last did something just for herself, and she'll give you a blank stare." He shifted his weight. Her ex-husband was an idiot. Good riddance to him, but it made her cautious. Thinks she missed her chance at the good stuff. Before I could respond, Leila reappeared with another glass of iced tea and a plate of cookies that looked homemade. "Dad, are you interrogating Blake about his life choices?" "Just making conversation," Paul said innocently. "Seeing if he knows anything about fixing daughters who work too hard." "That's not covered under my standard service agreement," I said, accepting the cookies gratefully. "But I could probably recommend a specialist." Leila laughed, a genuine sound that made something warm settle in my chest despite the oppressive heat. "Very funny, both of you." She shot her father a look that was equal parts affection and exasperation. "Dad, let Blake work. And Blake, ignore everything he just said." "I don't know," I said, installing the new capacitor with practiced efficiency. "He seems like a pretty reliable source. 40 years in construction? That's a man who knows how to read people." Paul nodded approvingly. "I like this one, Leila. He listens." "Dad." The warning in her voice was gentle but clear. "What? I'm just saying. Your mother would have liked him too. She always said you could tell a man's character by how he treats other people's broken things." I paused in my work, struck by the simple wisdom of that statement. "Your wife sounds like she was a smart woman." "Smartest person I ever met," Paul said quietly. "She saw through people's facades, straight to who they really were underneath. Made her a hell of a kindergarten teacher and an even better wife." The grief in his voice was raw, still fresh despite the months that had passed. I caught Leila's eyes, saw the way she watched her father with a mixture of love and helplessness that I recognized all too well. There's nothing quite like watching a parent navigate loss and knowing there's nothing you can do to fix it. "She taught kindergarten?" I asked, continuing my work while keeping the conversation flowing. 35 years, Leila said, settling back into her chair. Every kid in our town went through Mrs. Morrison's classroom at some point. She had this theory that if you could teach 5-year-olds to share and say please and thank you, you were building a better world one tiny human at a time. She wasn't wrong, I said, testing the new connections. Some of my best customers are people who remember basic manners. And some of your worst? Paul asked with interest. Let's just say there's a direct correlation between how people treat service workers and how often their equipment mysteriously breaks down. Paul chuckled. I knew I liked you. I fired up the system, listening to the compressor kick in with a healthy hum instead of the grinding death rattle it had been making. The outdoor unit began its familiar rhythm, and I could hear the indoor fan starting to circulate air through the house. Music to my ears, Leila said, visibly relaxing as cool air began flowing from the house. You're officially my hero, Blake. Davidson. Just doing my job. Though I have to say, this is probably the most civilized AC repair I've done all week. Usually I'm dodging angry customers who act like I personally broke their unit just to inconvenience them. People get cranky. When they're hot, Paul observed. Heat brings out the worst in folks. Cold too, for that matter. Margaret used to say that comfortable people are kinder people. Your wife was full of wisdom. That she was. Paul's expression grew thoughtful. She also used to say that the best conversations happen when people's hands are busy. Something about honest work-making for honest talk. As if to prove his point, I found myself sharing more than I usually did with customers. Maybe it was the heat making me lightheaded, or maybe it was the easy way this family made space for a stranger. But I heard myself saying, my dad had a heart attack last year. Nothing too serious, but it was a wake-up call. Made me realize how much of life I'd been putting on hold, waiting for the right time to really start living. What kind of things were you putting on hold? Leila asked gently. Oh, you know, the usual. Dating someone who actually gets my sense of humor instead of just tolerating it. Maybe starting my own business instead of working for someone else. Getting a dog that doesn't belong to my landlord. I laughed, but it came out a little hollow. 42 years old and still making excuses for why I haven't figured out what I want to be when I grow up. 42? Leila looked surprised. I would have guessed younger. Clean living and excellent genetics, I said, then immediately felt stupid for the obvious lie. Okay, fine. Sunscreen and avoiding mirrors in direct sunlight. Paul snorted, with laughter. Honest and funny. Margaret definitely would have approved. Dad, stop trying to marry me off to the AC repairman. I'm not trying to marry you off. I'm just saying your mother had good instincts about people, and if she were here, she'd probably invite Blake to stay for dinner. The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, and I realized I was holding my breath waiting for Leila's response. Which was ridiculous. I had 3 more service calls scheduled for the afternoon, and getting involved with customers was unprofessional at best and potentially disastrous at worst. I mean, Leila said slowly, I was planning to make pasta salad for dinner anyway. It's too hot to cook anything that requires the oven, and I always make too much. If you don't have other plans... He doesn't, Paul said before I could answer. He told me earlier that he goes home to leftover pizza and whatever's on Netflix. I did not say that, I protested, though he wasn't entirely wrong. You didn't have to. It's written all over your face. The look of a man who's forgotten how to make plans that don't involve work. Leila stood up and brushed dust off her jeans. Ignore him. He thinks everyone under 60 needs parenting. But the invitation stands if you're interested. Good food, decent company, and I promise Dad will only embarrass me a little bit. I should have said no. Professional boundaries, other appointments, the general wisdom of not getting personally involved with customers. But looking at Leila, really looking at her, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, the genuine warmth in her eyes, the easy confidence that came from someone who knew exactly who she was and wasn't apologizing for it. I found myself nodding. Pasta salad sounds great. Let me just finish cleaning up here and call my next appointment to reschedule. Really? Her smile was bright enough to power the AC unit I'd just fixed. Really? Besides, I said, packing up my tools, someone needs to make sure your dad doesn't spend the evening plotting my entire future. Too late for that, Paul called from the doorway. I've already decided you're staying. Dinner turned out to be one of those unexpectedly perfect evenings that sneaks up on you when you're not looking for it. Leila's pasta salad was incredible. Fresh vegetables from her garden, a vinaigrette that tasted like it came from a fancy restaurant, and chunks of mozzarella that she admitted to making herself because store-bought cheese has no soul. We ate on the covered patio as the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that made Phoenix look like something out of a postcard instead of a concrete oven. Paul regaled us with stories from his construction days, including a memorable incident involving a stubborn homeowner, a poorly planned bathroom renovation, and what he diplomatically called a small flood that became a large learning experience. The guy insisted he could install the plumbing himself, Paul said, gesturing with his fork. Kept saying, "How hard can it be?" Famous last words. By the time we got there the next morning, his bathroom looked like Niagara Falls, and he was standing in 3 inches of water holding a wrench like it had personally betrayed him. "Did you fix it?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. "Took us 2 weeks to undo the damage he'd done in one afternoon. Margaret used to say that confidence without competence is just expensive stupidity." "Your wife really did have a saying for everything," Leila observed, refilling our glasses, with more of that incredible iced tea. "She did. Drove me crazy sometimes, all that folk wisdom. But she was usually right." Paul's expression grew thoughtful. "She had one about second chances, too. Used to say that life gives you as many fresh starts as you're brave enough to take." The conversation continued as the heat of the day finally began to break. Paul told us about learning to text message so he could stay in touch with his grandchildren. I shared stories about my most memorable service calls, and Leila talked about her students at the community college, adult learners who were going back to school after raising families or changing careers. "There's something beautiful about watching a 55-year-old grandmother discover that she actually loves chemistry," she said. "Or seeing a guy who's been working construction his whole life realize he has a gift for writing poetry." People think there's some deadline for figuring out who you're supposed to be, but there isn't. You can reinvent yourself at any age. "Is that what you did when you moved here?" I asked. "Sort of. I was 45, recently divorced, and felt like I'd spent 20 years being who everyone else wanted me to be. My ex-husband had very specific ideas about what a professor's wife should look like, how she should act, what hobbies were appropriate." She shrugged. "So I moved to the desert, bought a house that was completely impractical for one person, and decided to figure out who Leila Morrison actually was when no one was watching." "And what did you discover?" "That I like making my own cheese, growing vegetables in ridiculous heat, and having conversations with strangers that last longer than 5 minutes." She smiled. "Also that I'm much funnier than my ex-husband ever gave me credit for." "His loss," Paul said firmly. As the evening wore on, Paul eventually excused himself to call his sister in Vermont and catch up on family news, leaving Leila and me alone on the patio. The desert twilight was settling around us, and the temperature had finally dropped below what felt like the surface of Mercury. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly. "Dad's been so withdrawn since Mom died. Tonight's the first time I've seen him really engage with anyone new. Thank you for inviting me. I can't remember the last time I had dinner with people who actually wanted to hear about my day. What's your living situation like? Roommates? Girlfriend? Secret family you haven't mentioned?" I laughed. "None of the above. Just me and an apartment that's perfectly adequate for someone who spends most of his time at work. My sister Maxine keeps threatening to set me up with her friends, but they're all lawyers or doctors who think manual labor is what other people do. And you don't want to date a lawyer or doctor? It's not about what they do for work. It's about, I don't know how to explain it. I want to be with someone who gets excited about the same things I do. Someone who thinks it's cool that I can diagnose a compressor problem by the sound it makes, or who understands why I get satisfaction from fixing something that was broken." Leila was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can I ask you something? And I need you to be honest, even if it's not what I want to hear." Something in her tone made me turn to look at her fully. She was staring out at her garden, where the automatic sprinkler system had just kicked in, sending arcs of water across the drought-resistant plants that somehow managed to look lush despite the harsh conditions. "Of course." She took a deep breath, then turned to face me. "I'm 50, Blake. 50 years old, divorced, living alone except for my elderly father, who's probably going to need more and more care as time goes on. I teach college students who think anyone over 30 is ancient, and I spend my weekends making cheese and talking to my plants. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was smaller, more vulnerable. Do you think I'm too old for love? Like, real love, not just companionship or settling for someone because we're both lonely? The question hung in the desert air between us, honest and raw and brave in a way that made my chest tighten. I realized that this moment, this exact moment, was going to matter. How I answered would either open a door or close it, and both options scared me. Leila, I said slowly, age isn't what makes someone too old for love. Fear does. Giving up does. Deciding that what you've already experienced is all you deserve. I met her eyes. You're not too old. You're not too anything. You're exactly the right age to know what you want and brave enough to ask for it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. Even with all the complications? The baggage? Everyone our age has baggage. The question is whether you find someone whose baggage fits nicely next to yours in the overhead compartment. She laughed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. That might be the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me. Then you've definitely been talking to the wrong people. I came back the next morning. Not because anything was wrong with the AC. That unit was humming along perfectly. I came back because I'd left my voltage meter in Leila's backyard. Or at least that's what I told myself as I pulled into her driveway at 8 a.m. with 2 cups of coffee from the place down the street. Leila answered the door in a paint-splattered t-shirt and shorts, her hair twisted up in a messy bun held together with what looked like a pencil. She had a streak of sage-green paint across her left cheek, and the satisfied expression of someone who'd been up early being productive. Blake? Is everything okay with the AC? AC's fine. I just, left some equipment here yesterday. I held up the coffee cups. Thought you might need caffeine. Her smile was worth the awkward excuse. You are officially my favorite person today. Come on back. Dad's already interrogating the mailman about suspicious activity in the neighborhood. I followed her through the house, noticing the living room wall that was half painted in a warm sage green that complemented the desert landscape visible through the large windows. Redecorating? I asked. Nesting. Or re-nesting. I've been in this house 5 years, and I'm finally making it look like me instead of like the model home it was when I bought it. She accepted the coffee gratefully. Dad thinks I'm having a midlife crisis, but I prefer to think of it as a midlife awakening. We found Paul in the backyard, standing near the AC unit with a serious expression and a notebook. Morning, Blake, he said without looking up. You might want to check your work. This thing's been making noise all night. My heart sank. What kind of noise? The good kind. Working noise. First time I've slept through the night since I got here. Paul grinned. But that's not why you're really here, is it? Dad, Leila warned. What? The boy's smitten. Look at him. Brought coffee and everything. Your mother would have called this courting behavior. Before I could respond to Paul's extremely accurate assessment of my motivations, a voice called from the side yard. You-hoo, Leila? Everything all right over there? A woman in her 60s appeared around the corner, wearing a sun hat that could provide shade for a small family and carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. She had the determined expression of someone who considered neighborhood surveillance a civic duty. Morning, Mrs. Caldwell, Leila said with the patient tone of someone who'd had this conversation before. I noticed there was a strange truck here. Yesterday. And again this morning. Mrs. Caldwell's eyes fixed on me with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. Are you having work done? Just some AC maintenance, Leila replied smoothly. Mrs. Caldwell made a note on her clipboard. And you are? She asked me directly. Blake Davidson, Desert Air Solutions. I see. And do you always make house calls this early in the morning? Paul stepped forward with the easy authority of a man who dealt with difficult people for decades. Ma'am, in Phoenix in July, the smart contractors start early before it gets too hot to work. Blake here's just being thorough, making sure everything's running properly. Mrs. Caldwell looked between the three of us, clearly sensing there was more to the story, but unable to pinpoint exactly what. Well, just so you know, We have a very quiet neighborhood here. We like to keep it that way. Of course, Leila said, politely. Have a good day, Mrs. Caldwell. As soon as she was out of earshot, Paul shook his head. That woman's got way too much time on her hands. She means well, Leila said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She's just protective of the neighborhood. Her husband died 2 years ago, and I think keeping track of everyone's business gives her something to do. Still, Paul said, might want to be careful. Women like that love to talk, and they don't always get their facts straight. I found myself wondering what exactly Mrs. Caldwell thought she'd witnessed, and whether I cared. The truth was, I was 42 years old and perfectly capable of having coffee with a woman who interested me. But I also lived in a world where customer complaints could affect my business reputation. Maybe I should... I started. Don't you dare, Leila interrupted. Don't let some busybody neighbor dictate how you live your life. Besides, she added with a mischievous smile, if we're going to give her something to talk about, we might as well make it worth her while. What do you mean? I mean, she said, pulling the pencil out of her hair and letting it fall loose around her shoulders. How do you feel about helping me paint? I've got another wall to finish, and it's much more fun with company. Paul chuckled. Now you're talking. Margaret always said the best way to handle gossips is to give them something harmless to gossip about while you do what you want anyway. Is that another one of her sayings? I asked. No, that one's mine. But she would have agreed. 2 hours later, we'd finished the accent wall in Leila's living room, and I had paint in my hair and what Paul diplomatically called artistic enhancement on my work shirt. Mrs. Caldwell had walked by twice more, each time slowing down just enough to peer through the windows and confirm that yes, the AC repairman was still there. And yes, he was now helping with home improvement projects. She's going to burst if she doesn't find someone to tell about this soon, Leila observed, watching our neighbor retreat with obvious reluctance. Let her talk, I said, standing back to admire our work. We're just two adults painting a wall. Are we? Leila asked quietly. The question hung in the air like paint fumes, loaded with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself at Leila's house more often than my own apartment. Not for AC repairs, that system was running perfectly, but for what Paul called maintenance visits, and what I was starting to think of as the best part of my day. I helped Leila install new ceiling fans in the bedrooms, taught her how to change the air filters herself, and somehow ended up rebuilding her back porch steps when Paul mentioned they were getting wobbly. Each project led to another conversation, another shared meal, another reason to stay just a little longer. You know, Leila said one evening as we sat on those newly rebuilt steps watching the sunset, I think you're avoiding your own life by fixing mine. Maybe, I admitted. But your life is more interesting than mine. That's because you're in it now. The honesty of that statement should have scared me. Instead, it felt like coming home. It was Paul who introduced us to the neighbors who actually mattered. The ones who brought casseroles instead of clipboards, who borrowed tools and returned them clean, who understood that good fences make good neighbors, but open gates make good friends. Samson Torres lived next door on the other side from Mrs. Caldwell. He was a retired firefighter who spent his mornings tending to a garden that somehow produced perfect tomatoes despite the desert, heat, and his afternoons building intricate birdhouses in his garage workshop. When he knocked on Leila's door one Saturday morning with a basket of those impossible tomatoes, I was in her kitchen trying to fix a cabinet door that had been hanging crooked since she moved in. You must be Blake, he said, extending a calloused hand. Paul's told me about you. Says you're good with broken things. I try to be. Mind taking a look at my evaporative cooler when you get a chance? Things been acting up, and my wife Nora's threatening to move back to San Diego if I don't get it fixed soon. That's how I met Nora Torres, a retired nurse with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from 3 decades of dealing with people at their worst, and somehow still believing in their capacity for goodness. She emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of agua fresca, and wearing an expression that suggested she'd already formed an opinion about me, and was just waiting to see if I'd live up to it. So, you're the AC man who's been monopolizing our neighbor's time, she said, but she was smiling when she said it. I prefer to think of myself as a full-service home maintenance professional, I replied, which made her laugh. He fixed our garbage disposal last week, Leila added, and helped Dad install grab bars in the bathroom. Grab bars? Nora's expression shifted to professional interest. Good thinking. Paul's been using that tub like he's still 40 instead of pushing 80. I am not pushing 80, Paul protested from the porch. I'm barely past 75. Honey, Nora said gently, you're 78, and there's no shame in taking precautions. Samson installed them in our bathroom 2 years ago, and I sleep better knowing he's not going to slip and break his stubborn neck. That afternoon, while I worked on the Torres cooler, the wives, as Leila jokingly called herself, and Nora, sat in the shade planning what Nora called a proper welcome party for Paul. He needs to meet people his own age, Nora explained. There's a whole community of retirees in this neighborhood who get together for coffee every Tuesday and complain about their ailments. Paul would fit right in. He's not much for socializing, Leila said. Mom was the social one. All the more reason to ease him into it. Trust me, I've seen what happens to widowed men who isolate themselves. It's not pretty. The party happened the following weekend, and somehow I'd been recruited as the official handyman for any last-minute fixes needed to make Leila's backyard party ready, which is how I found myself stringing lights with Samson, while Abigail Martinez from down the street directed operations like a general commanding troops. Abigail was in her 40s, divorced, and raising twin teenagers while running her own accounting business from her home office. She had the organizational skills of a military strategist and the energy of someone who'd learned to get things done efficiently, because there was no one else to do them. Higher on the left, she called out to us. Paul's going to want to see those lights from every angle when he tells the story later. You think he'll like this? Leila asked, adjusting the tablecloth for the third time. Honey, Nora said, carrying out a tray of her famous flan. Your father hasn't had anyone fuss over him properly since your mother died. He's going to love it, even if he pretends to grumble about all the attention. She was right. When Paul emerged from the house that evening to find his daughter's backyard transformed into a warm, welcoming space filled with neighbors who genuinely wanted to meet him. His eyes filled with tears, he tried to hide by immediately complaining that the music was too loud. These old ears can't handle all this noise, he grumbled. But he was smiling. When he said it, that's okay, called out Jim Peterson, another retired construction worker who'd heard about Paul through the neighborhood grapevine. We're all half-deaf anyway. Won't matter if we have to shout. As the evening progressed, I watched Leila move through her own party, making sure everyone had enough food, that conversations were flowing, that her father was comfortable. She was in her element, and I realized this was who she really was, when she felt safe and supported. A natural hostess, a connector of people. Someone who created community wherever she went. She's special, isn't she? Nora appeared beside me, following my gaze. Yeah, I said quietly. She really is. Good. Because if you hurt her, Samson and I will have to kill you. Nothing personal. I looked at her, startled, but she was grinning. Welcome to the neighborhood, Blake. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning when I arrived at Leila's house to find her standing in her driveway, staring at her car with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that the universe had a personal vendetta against her. Please tell me you know something about cars, she said without looking up, because I'm pretty sure mine just died. I walked over to where her 15-year-old Honda Civic sat silent and accusatory in the morning heat. The hood was already up, and I could smell the telltale sweetness of antifreeze mixed with the acrid scent of something that had definitely overheated. What happened? I was driving back from the grocery store yesterday when it started making this horrible grinding noise, like someone was torturing a robot. Then steam started pouring out from under the hood, so I pulled over and called a tow truck. She gestured helplessly at the car. The mechanic said it needs a new engine. Apparently the timing belt snapped and destroyed everything in its path. I winced. On a car that old, a catastrophic engine failure was essentially a death sentence. How much? More than the car's worth. Way more than I can afford right now. She leaned against the garage door, looking suddenly exhausted. I've been putting money aside for Dad's medical expenses, and I just paid for the paint and supplies for the house renovations. A new engine might as well be a new rocket ship. What about used cars? Same problem. Anything reliable costs more than I have, and anything I can afford probably won't last 6 months. She ran her hands through her hair. I teach 3 classes at the community college, and they're all in person. I can't do my job without a car. That's when Paul appeared from the house, moving more slowly than usual and looking pale around the edges. Dad? Are you okay? Leila was at his side immediately. Just a little dizzy, probably the heat, but he was breathing harder than he should have been. And when I looked closer, I could see the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of something more serious than heat exhaustion. Let's get you inside, I said, taking his other arm. When's the last time you had water? This morning. I'm fine, it's just… Paul swayed slightly, and if we hadn't been holding his arms, he would have fallen. Hospital, Leila said immediately. We're going to the hospital. I don't need a hospital. I need to sit down and drink some water. Dad, you're not fine, and we're not taking chances. She was already reaching for her phone when she remembered. Oh God, the car. The next hour was a blur of phone calls and logistics that felt like trying to solve a puzzle while the pieces kept changing shape. Paul needed medical attention, but Leila's car was dead. My work truck only had 2 seats, and calling an ambulance felt like overkill for what might just be dehydration, except neither of us was qualified to make that determination. That's when Samson Torres knocked on the front door. Nora sent me over with more tomatoes, he said, then took one look at our faces and immediately shifted into crisis mode. What's wrong? Paul's not feeling well, and I need to get him to the emergency room, but my car, say no more. Samson was already pulling his keys from his pocket. My truck's got a back seat, and I know exactly where the ER is. Let's go. Paul protested the entire way to the hospital, insisting that we were making a big fuss over nothing, but his color had improved significantly once we got him into air conditioning and pumped him full of cold water. The ER doctor, a competent-looking woman in her 30s who had clearly dealt with stubborn elderly patients before, ran a series of tests and determined that Paul was indeed severely dehydrated. His blood pressure was dangerously elevated, and he was showing early signs of heat exhaustion. In a man his age, this could have been serious, she explained to Leila while Paul napped in the hospital bed, hooked up to an IV. Phoenix heat is no joke, especially for people who aren't acclimated. He's going to be fine, but he needs to be more careful about staying hydrated and limiting his time outdoors. He's from Vermont, Leila said quietly. He's never dealt with heat like this. That explains it. A lot of transplants underestimate how quickly dehydration can set in here. The good news is, he'll be ready to go home in a few hours once we get his fluid levels back up. While Paul recovered, Leila and I sat in the hospital waiting room, and the full weight of our situation settled over us like a heavy blanket. I can't take care of him without a car, she said finally. What if this had happened when you and Samson weren't around? What if I'd been at work? He could have collapsed alone in that heat. We'll figure something out. With what money, Blake? I'm a community college instructor. I don't have savings for emergencies like this. Her voice cracked slightly. I moved him out here because I thought it would be good for him, and now I can't even get him to a doctor when he needs one. Hey, I took her hand. This isn't your fault. Heat exhaustion can happen to anyone. But it happened to him because I couldn't afford to keep my car running. She wiped her eyes with her free hand. I'm 50 years old, and I can't even manage to keep the basic necessities of life working properly. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a broken car or a dehydrated father. This was about Leila questioning whether she was strong enough, capable enough, successful enough to handle the life she'd built for herself. It was about every doubt she'd ever had about starting over, about being alone, about whether she deserved the happiness she'd been tentatively reaching for. Leila, I said firmly, you are one of the strongest, most capable people I've ever met, and you're not handling this alone anymore. The solution came from the most unexpected source. My nephew Zion, who was spending the summer with my sister Maxine while supposedly figuring out what he wanted to do with his life, now that he'd graduated college with a degree in something called digital media arts and the career prospects of a medieval blacksmith. Uncle Blake, he said, appearing at my apartment door on Wednesday morning with the manic energy of someone who'd just solved world hunger. I have an idea that's either brilliant or completely insane. those are usually the same thing with you, I said, letting him in. What is it this time? Crowdfunding. We start a GoFundMe for Leila's car situation, but we make it about more than just the money. We tell the story. Single woman taking care of her elderly father. Beloved teacher who helps adult students get their lives back on track. Pillar of the community who needs community support. His eyes lit up with the fervor of a recent graduate, who still believed the internet could solve everything. We make a video, get testimonials from her students and neighbors, show people who she really is. Zion, I know what you're thinking. It's charity, and proud people don't like charity. But it's not charity if it's a community investment. If people feel like they're contributing to something that makes their world better. The kid had a point. More than that, he had skills I definitely didn't. Video editing, social media strategy, and the kind of digital native confidence that could turn a simple request for help into something that felt meaningful. What would you need? Permission from Leila, interviews with people who know her, and about 3 days to put it together. Zion was already pulling out his phone. I've been working on community-focused content for my portfolio anyway. This could be perfect. That evening, I broached the subject with Leila while we sat on her back porch watching Paul play chess with Samson Torres. Paul was winning, which was putting him in a better mood than he'd been in since the hospital visit. Absolutely not, Leila said immediately. I'm not asking strangers on the internet for money. You're not asking. Other people are asking on your behalf. Same thing. Is it though? When the Torres family's house flooded 2 years ago, didn't half the neighborhood show up with tools and materials to help with repairs? That's different. That was neighbors helping neighbors. How is this different? She was quiet for a moment, watching her father laugh at something Samson had said. Because neighbors help because they know you, because they see the work you put into being part of their community. Internet strangers help because they feel sorry for you, or because they recognize someone who makes their community better and want to invest in keeping that person around. The next morning, Zion showed up with his camera equipment and the persistence of a journalist who'd scented a Pulitzer Prize. Within an hour, he'd somehow convinced Paul to sit for an interview about his daughter's character and professional dedication. She's got more grit than a construction site, Paul told the camera, his Vermont accent making every word sound like fundamental truth. Moved out here to start over after her divorce, built herself a life from scratch. Now she's teaching kids who thought they'd missed their chance that it's never too late to learn something new. What would you want people to know about her? Zion asked from behind the camera. That she's the kind of person who makes anywhere she lives a better place. When Margaret was sick, Leila flew back to Vermont every weekend for 6 months to help. With doctor appointments and medications, never complained, never made it seem like a burden, just did what needed doing because that's who she is. By afternoon, Zion had interviewed Samson and Nora, who spoke about Leila's role in organizing the neighborhood watch and her willingness to help elderly residents with technology problems. Abigail Martinez talked about how Leila had helped her daughter with college application essays, and Jim Peterson described how she'd connected him with resources for veterans' benefits that he hadn't known existed. She sees what people need and finds ways to help, Nora told the camera. Not in a showy way, just quietly making sure her neighbors are taken care of. The breakthrough came when Zion convinced Leila to let him film her at work. 3 of her students agreed to speak on camera about how her classes had changed their lives. Maria Santos, a 53-year-old grandmother, explained how Leila's encouragement had helped her overcome her fear of public speaking well enough to get promoted to a supervisor position at her job. Robert Kim, a retired veteran in his 60s, talked about how Leila's writing workshops had helped him process his military experiences and connect with his estranged adult children. And Sarah Williams, a 42-year-old single mother, described how Leila had stayed after class every Tuesday for 2 months to help her improve her math skills enough to pass the entrance exam for nursing school. She doesn't just teach the subject, Sarah said. She teaches you to believe you can learn it. When Zion showed us the rough cut that evening, even Leila had to admit it was compelling. I look like a real teacher, she said, surprised. You are a real teacher, I said. You're also a real person who deserves help when she needs it. The video went live on Thursday morning with a modest goal of $5,000. Enough for a reliable used car and some basic maintenance. By Thursday evening, it had raised $800 and been shared 47 times. It's working, Zion announced, refreshing the page obsessively. People are responding. What none of us expected was how much the campaign would reveal about the community Leila had built around herself, and how many people had been quietly grateful for her presence in their lives. But we also didn't expect Mrs. Caldwell's response when she discovered that her neighborhood was the subject of what she called internet begging. Mrs. Caldwell's counterattack came on Friday morning in the form of a printed flyer that appeared in every mailbox on Saguaro Street. The heading read, "Protecting Our Neighborhood Values," in bold, threatening font that probably came from the same desktop publishing software she used for her Christmas newsletter complaints. "Someone in our community," the flyer announced, "has decided to air our private business on the internet for financial gain. This is not only inappropriate, but potentially dangerous, inviting strangers to focus their attention on our quiet residential area." The flyer went on to express concern about outside elements being drawn to the neighborhood and suggested that residents reconsider supporting activities that compromise our security and privacy. "She doesn't mention you by name," Nora observed as we stood in Leila's driveway studying the offending document. "But she doesn't have to." "The whole thing is ridiculous," Samson added. "We've got Ring doorbells and security cameras on half the houses on this street. What does she think is going to happen? Criminals are going to see a GoFundMe for a teacher's car and decide to rob us?" But Mrs. Caldwell's campaign was having an effect. By Friday afternoon, the crowdfunding donations had slowed to a trickle, and Leila was getting sideways looks from neighbors she'd never met but who had apparently decided she was some kind of internet grifter. "Maybe we should just cancel the whole thing," she said, staring at her laptop screen where the campaign sat at $3,700. Close to the goal, but not quite there. "I don't want to cause problems in the neighborhood." "You're not causing problems," I said firmly. "Mrs. Caldwell is causing problems because she's afraid of anything she can't control." "But what if she's right? What if I'm just asking for handouts? Then every GoFundMe for medical bills, disaster relief, and community projects is asking for handouts," Zion said from his position on the living room floor, where he was editing testimonial videos on his laptop. "You know what the difference is between what you're doing and actual grifting? Grifters lie. Everything in your campaign is true." That's when Paul shuffled in from the kitchen, moving slowly but looking significantly better than he had since the hospital visit. "What's all this fuss about that woman and her flyers?" We explained Mrs. Caldwell's objections, and Paul listened with the patient expression of someone who dealt with difficult people for 7 decades. "You know what your mother would have said about this?" he asked Leila. "That Mrs. Caldwell needs a hobby? That some people are so afraid of their own problems they spend all their energy worrying about everyone else's." Paul settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone whose body had recently reminded him it wasn't 30 anymore. "Margaret had a neighbor like that back in Vermont, Mrs. Patterson. Spent so much time watching what everyone else was doing that she never noticed her own house falling apart." "What happened to her?" Zion asked, looking up from his computer. "Eventually people stopped caring what she thought and started making decisions based on what was actually good for the community." Paul shrugged. "Turns out, when you ignore a bully long enough, they either go away or find someone else to bother." The breakthrough came that evening when Jim Peterson knocked on the door with a folded piece of paper and the grim expression of someone who'd uncovered something unpleasant. "You need to see this," he said, handing the paper to Leila. "Found it tucked under my windshield wiper this morning." The note was handwritten in the same careful script as Mrs. Caldwell's flyers. "Ask your neighbor about her real reason for needing money. Teachers make good salaries. What is she really spending it on? She's questioning my integrity now?" Leila's voice was tight with anger. "She's suggesting I'm lying about needing the money?" "Gets worse," Jim continued. "Talked to the Hendersons on Mesquite Street. They got the same note, except theirs said to ask about your friend who's around all the time, implying that maybe the money is for something other than a car." I felt heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the Phoenix Sun. "She's spreading rumors about us?" "Looks that way. Classic small-town gossip tactics. Plant seeds of doubt. Let people's imaginations fill in the blanks." Paul stood up with more energy than he'd shown all week. "That's enough. Margaret always said there were 2 ways to deal with people like this: ignore them until they go away, or call them out publicly so everyone can see who they really are." "Dad, we can't just—" "Yes, we can. Jim, how many people have gotten these notes?" At least 6 houses that I know of, probably more. Then it's time for a neighborhood meeting. Real one, not Mrs. Caldwell's passive-aggressive flyer campaign. Paul's construction foreman voice was emerging, the tone that had managed job sites for 40 years. We get everyone together, air this out in the open, and let people make decisions based on facts instead of whispers. A public confrontation? Leila looked uncertain. That seems like escalating things. Honey, Nora said, gently. She already escalated things when she started questioning your character. Now it's time to defend it. Zion looked up from his laptop with the gleeful expression of someone who just realized they could turn a neighborhood drama into compelling content. Can I film it? Absolutely not, Leila said immediately. Come on, this could be great for the campaign narrative. Truth versus gossip, community coming together. No cameras at the meeting, I said firmly. This isn't entertainment. This is Leila's life. But as we planned the neighborhood gathering for Sunday evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Caldwell's attack was about more than just protecting neighborhood privacy. There was something personal in the way she was targeting Leila specifically. Something that felt less like community concern and more like individual malice. Jim, I said as he prepared to leave, has Mrs. Caldwell ever had problems with other neighbors, other campaigns like this? Jim paused at the door. Not like this, no. But now that you mention it, she was pretty upset when the Garcias put their house on the market last month. Kept saying it would bring down property values, attract the wrong kind of people. He looked uncomfortable. She's got some pretty strong opinions about who belongs in this neighborhood and who doesn't. As the door closed behind him, I realized we weren't just dealing with a busybody neighbor. We were dealing with someone who had decided that Leila didn't belong here, and who was willing to destroy her reputation to prove it. The truth about Mrs. Caldwell came from an unexpected source. Leila's ex-husband, who called on Saturday morning, with the worst possible timing and a revelation that changed everything. Leila, it's David. I know we don't talk, but I got a strange call yesterday that I thought you should know about. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard Leila's voice go cold in a way I'd never heard before. What kind of call? A woman claiming to be your neighbor in Phoenix. She said she was concerned about your situation and wanted to know about your character, your financial history, whether you'd ever been involved in any kind of fraud or misconduct. Leila sank into a chair, her face pale. She called you? My ex-husband? She knew details, Leila. About the divorce, about the house we lost, about your father moving in with you. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This was someone who'd done research. Paul appeared in the doorway, drawn by the tension, in Leila's voice. I put the call on speaker so we could all hear. What did you tell her? Leila asked. The truth. That you were the most honest person I knew. That our divorce had nothing to do with money or misconduct. And that she had no business calling me about your private life. David paused. But Leila. She knew things. About your mother's medical bills, about why you moved to Arizona. She's been digging into your background. After Leila hung up, we sat in stunned silence. Mrs. Caldwell hadn't just been spreading neighborhood gossip. She'd been conducting what amounted to a private investigation. Why would she go that far? Leila asked. What did I ever do to her? The answer came an hour later when Abigail Martinez knocked on the door with information that painted a very different picture of our antagonist. I should have told you this earlier, Abigail said, settling into the living room with the uncomfortable posture of someone about to reveal an unpleasant truth. Mrs. Caldwell's been having problems for a while now. Financial problems. What kind of problems? Paul asked. Her husband left her with a lot of debt when he died. Credit cards, a second mortgage she didn't know about, medical bills from his cancer treatment. She's been trying to keep up appearances, but word is she's behind on her house payments. That's terrible, Leila said softly. But what does that have to do with you? Abigail's expression was grim. Because 3 months ago, she applied for a position at the community college. Part-time administrative work, something to bring in extra income. The job went to someone else, but she found out recently that you were on the hiring committee. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Mrs. Caldwell hadn't been protecting the neighborhood from Leila. She'd been targeting her out of personal resentment, convinced that Leila had somehow cost her a job she desperately needed. She thinks I kept her from getting hired? Leila's voice was barely a whisper. Worse than that. She thinks you're everything she's not. Financially stable, professionally respected, surrounded by people who care about you. You represent the life she feels like she's lost. Paul's jaw tightened. So she decided to try to take Leila down a peg. More than that, I realized. She was trying to destroy Leila's reputation before the whole neighborhood figured out what she was going through herself. If everyone was focused on Leila's supposed problems, they wouldn't notice Mrs. Caldwell's real ones. That's why she's been so invested in making you look bad, Abigail continued. It's not about neighborhood values or internet privacy. It's about a woman who's drowning and thinks the only way to save herself is to pull someone else under. The revelation changed everything about how we understood the situation, but it also made it more complicated. Mrs. Caldwell wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was someone in genuine distress, lashing out at the wrong target because she couldn't face her own problems. What do we do now? Leila asked. None of us had an easy answer. The neighborhood meeting happened on Sunday evening in Leila's backyard, under the same string lights that had welcomed Paul just weeks earlier. But this gathering had a very different energy. 23 neighbors seated in a loose circle, with the kind of tension that comes when a community is forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Mrs. Caldwell arrived exactly on time, dressed as if she were attending a city council meeting rather than a backyard discussion. She carried her ever-present clipboard and wore the rigid posture of someone preparing for battle. I want to start by saying something, Leila began, standing in the center of the circle. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands trembling, slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, I know you've been struggling financially since your husband passed away. I know you applied for a position at the college and didn't get it. And I want you to know that I had nothing to do with that decision. Mrs. Caldwell's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment. I don't know what you're talking about. The hiring committee makes decisions collectively, Leila continued gently. I wasn't even part of the process for that particular position. But more importantly, I know how hard it is to ask for help when you need it. Because I'm struggling with the same thing right now. This is completely inappropriate, Mrs. Caldwell said, standing abruptly. My personal business is not— You made it everyone's business when you started spreading rumors about mine, Paul interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd managed construction crews for 40 years. Now sit down and let people talk. Samson Torres cleared his throat. Dorothy, we've been neighbors for 6 years. If you needed help, why didn't you just ask? I don't need help, Mrs. Caldwell said stiffly. I'm managing just fine. Are you? Nora's voice was gentle but direct. Because calling Leila's ex-husband to dig up dirt on her doesn't sound like managing. It sounds like someone who's scared and angry and taking it out on the wrong person. What followed was the most uncomfortable and necessary conversation I'd ever witnessed. One by one, neighbors shared their own stories of financial struggles, family crises, and the shame that comes with needing help. Jim Peterson talked about using food pantries after his disability benefits were cut. Abigail Martinez admitted to taking on extra accounting clients to afford her twins' school supplies. Even Samson, who seemed to have everything together, revealed that he and Nora had been quietly helping pay for his mother's assisted living care. The point is, Nora said finally, we all need help sometimes. The difference is whether we're honest about it or whether we attack other people for being brave enough to ask. Mrs. Caldwell sat in silence through most of the discussion, her clipboard clutched like armor. But when Maria Santos, one of Leila's students, stood up to speak, something shifted. Mrs. Morrison didn't just teach me English composition, Maria said. She taught me that it's okay to start over at 53. That it's okay to admit you don't know everything and ask for help learning. She looked directly at Mrs. Caldwell. Maybe that's something we all need to remember. The meeting ended without dramatic apologies or sudden reconciliations. Mrs. Caldwell left without speaking to anyone, but she also stopped her whisper campaign. The anonymous notes ceased appearing, and the neighborhood rumors died down. But the real resolution came 3 days later, when someone left an envelope in Leila's mailbox containing $500 bills and a simple note. For the car fund, from someone who understands. We never found out for certain who sent it, but I had my suspicions. The GoFundMe reached its goal that same week, and by the following Sunday, Leila was driving a reliable used Honda that Samson had helped her find, through a friend at his old fire station. "It's not fancy," she said, running her hand over the steering wheel, "but it's mine." "Sometimes that's enough," I replied, thinking about more than just cars. 3 months later, I was back in Leila's backyard, but this time I wasn't fixing anything. I was sitting on the porch steps we'd rebuilt together, watching Paul teach Zion how to properly prune dessert roses while Leila graded papers at the patio table. The temperature had finally dropped below 90 degrees, which in Phoenix qualified as sweater weather. "You know," Leila said, looking up from a student essay about second careers, "I never thanked you properly." "For what?" "For showing up that first day and staying. For not running when things got complicated." She set down her red pen and really looked at me. "For answering my question honestly." "Which question was that?" She smiled. "You know which one." I did know. The question that had started all of this, whether she was too old for love. The question that had been brave and vulnerable and exactly the kind of honesty that had made me want to be worthy of knowing her. "I've been thinking about that conversation," I said. "About what I said about baggage and overhead compartments. Second thoughts? Actually, I think I was wrong. It's not about finding someone whose baggage fits with yours. It's about finding someone whose journey makes sense with yours. Someone whose next chapter you want to be part of writing." Paul looked up from his impromptu gardening lesson. "You two talking about something important over there?" "Just discussing travel metaphors," Leila called back. "Your mother loved travel metaphors," Paul said to the desert roses. "Always said life was like a long road trip where you couldn't see the destination, but you could choose who rides shotgun." Zion straightened up, wiping dirt from his hands. "That's actually pretty profound, Mr. Morrison." "Don't sound so surprised. I'm full of profound observations. Just ask Blake. I've been giving him relationship advice for months." "You have not," I protested. "Haven't I? Who told you to stop making excuses and just show up? Who said Leila needed someone who saw her as she really was instead of who she used to be?" I had to admit he had a point. As the evening settled around us, I realized this was what happiness looked like for me. Not dramatic declarations or grand gestures, but quiet moments with people who had chosen to let me into their lives. Leila, correcting papers while humming under her breath. Paul passing on 40 years of construction wisdom to a kid who would probably never build anything more complex than IKEA furniture. And me feeling more at home in someone else's backyard than I had ever felt in my own apartment. "Blake," Leila said softly, her hand finding mine. "I'm 51 now. Do you think I'm too old for love?" I squeezed her hand and smiled. "I think you're exactly the right age for everything that matters." She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I knew that whatever came next, whether it was more neighborhood drama, more family complications, or just the ordinary challenges of building a life with someone, we would face it together. Some repairs, I had learned, fix more than just broken machines. Sometimes they fix hearts that had forgotten they weren't actually broken, just waiting for the right person to help them work properly again. "Besides," I added, "I'm pretty good with things that need fixing." "Good," she said, "because I'm pretty good with things that need taking care of." And in the desert evening, surrounded by people we'd chosen to call family, that felt like the most perfect arrangement in the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.